Hey guys, so we're going to be continuing on with the exposure triangle. I'm moving on to the next part is shutter speed. So when we're talking about shutter speed, what we're referring to is how fast our camera is able to take a picture. So if we look at this graph over here, shutter speed, it's always referred to as like 1 over however fast it is. So it's from 1/1000th of a second here to half a second, right? So if we look at the images right above it when we're talking about shutter speed, that first one, 1/1000th of a second, that's gonna really capture the whole image, like crisp and in focus, you know? So when you are trying to introduce a little bit of motion blur and kind of go do something different, right? You're gonna be obviously going to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is you're gonna be slowing down your shutter speed. So if you look at the images right above the numbers, right? On the left, 1/1000th of a second, you have a really crisp, caught in the moment like runner. And on the very end to the right, you see what's the semblance of a runner, but there's a lot of that motion blur and movement. So the thing about shutter speed, typically we always refer to it as motion because it's how fast your camera can capture, your image, right? So that's the main way you can think about it. It's like, okay, if something's moving fast, I need to have a faster shutter speed, and then vice versa. If it's not moving as fast, and then I can probably get away with something a little bit less. But the other main part of shutter speed is actually, compensating for the amount of light that you have in your environment. So let's say you're out in the middle of the day, it's sunny, maybe like 10 o'clock, and you are shooting at ISO 100, right? Your aperture, let's say, is just like f4, but your shutter speed is at like, 1/30th of a second. Now, 1/30th of a second is not, it's not as slow as half a second, right? If you look at the images, but that's still not very fast in the grand scheme of things, especially when you're out in the middle of the day, 10 o'clock in the sun. What you're gonna notice, chances are your image is gonna be too bright or overexposed. Right? So an easy way to compensate for that is just to raise your shutter speed, right? When you raise your shutter speed, you're gonna make the shutter work faster, but as it's working faster, it's actually gonna be it's gonna be taking the image faster than the light can blow out the image, if that makes sense. So essentially, you use shutter speed to capture fast motion, to introduce motion blur when you slow it down, or you use it to compensate up and down for if you have too much light or not enough light when you're controlling your shutter speed is like your main camera setting to compensate for exposure. I talk about it like this because that's typically what I do the most. When I am shooting out in the field, I am using shutter speed more often than not to compensate for my exposure as I am working. So this is gonna be probably one of the fastest ways for you guys to do that. I have a few examples here. If we look at these two images, now the one on the left, this was taken while I was on a trip in Japan with some friends of mine. So you notice that we have the motion blur of the cars, but comparing it to the background's pretty much in focus. The person here, you can see a little bit of movement in the foot, right? But for the most part, everything's in focus, right? So we look at my shutter speed first, right? It's 1/15th of a second. That's how I'm allowing these cars to come in my image, but still have that nice movement blur to show off that movement, right? But look at my aperture, right? My aperture is at f14. So that means it's like I had to really close down to capture more that's in focus, right? Part of that is because I do have a wide scene. I wanted to capture a lot of this in focus. There's also this really nice bright sun coming right down on the side of this building. This was at like 8 o'clock, I think. And, it's also kind of a safety buffer too when you're doing something like motion blur so that you have more in focus so that you have a better chance at capturing the image, right? And also because it's the beginning of the day, I don't need too much extra light. I'm shooting at ISO 50, right? So you see how that is starting to that came together for that image. Now we have something totally different here on the right. I was invited to do pictures at a wiener dog derby during Halloween a few years ago where they raced wiener dogs. In this image, right, you have two dogs who are very much running. You can tell like he's mid-air right there. Look at our shutter speed, 1/1600th of a second. That's super fast. Like in comparison to 1/15th versus like 1/1600, totally different. Right, my ISO is at 100. I just left it there, and then the fastest aperture that my lens had was 2.8. I like 2.8 because I was able to still capture them in focus and get a nice bit of detail from the people in the background who are obviously excited, watching these dogs race. So that's it for shutter speed, guys. I feel like it's pretty straightforward, but just like always, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. Okay.